Ukrainians, in fact, did not start this war. They did not cross the Russian border. They want security guarantees, more durable security guarantees than the ones they gave in 1994 to give up their nuclear weapons. Ukrainians demand tangible security assurances, not mere promises once more. The Ukrainians want the freedom to pursue a closer relationship with the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Again, that makes sense because, again, the Russians continue to press.
It seems that more and more supporters of Donald Trump are starting to see things a little more clearly. And here is one of them. Conservative journalist Ben Shapiro, who recently spoke with Volodymyr Zelensky. And today, after this interview with Zelensky, Ben Shapiro is giving his feedback on the interview. And it turns out that he absolutely disagrees with Donald Trump's position. He says that Trump is very weak regarding Russia and Ukraine, claims that Trump is substituting concepts, and suddenly Ben Shapiro says that no, you can't put pressure on Ukraine. That's some kind of weakness. You actually need to put pressure on Putin and Russia. And in this episode, I want to remind you a little about the interview between Ben Shapiro and Zelensky, and actually quote Ben Shapiro's assessment after this interview of Donald Trump's foreign policy. And just for a second, Ben Shapiro is part of the so-called pool of influencers, conservative journalists. For example, Joe Rogan, Dave Portnoy, and Ben Shapiro have always been among the supporters of Donald Trump. They have a huge audience. Ben Shapiro has about 7.5 million subscribers on YouTube and on Twitter. He founded the Daily Wire. So he has such a huge media platform, and the Trump supporters have always used it. Ben Shapiro, in principle, has always been a supporter of Trump. And then suddenly, after the interview with Zelensky, Ben Shapiro starts criticizing Donald Trump. So let's take a closer look at all of this here. I'm Alexei Pichi. It's April 27th. Let's review in order. First, let me briefly remind you that the founder of Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro, interviewed Zelensky. And many people were waiting for this interview to be released. Why? Because he is quite a conservative journalist, a conservative influencer who has always been on Donald Trump's side. And obviously, many expected that Ben Shapiro would criticize Zelensky in the style of, I don't know, Juris Dr. Vance. Well, that's it. In the interview, Zelensky stressed that Ukraine sees the United States as a powerful strategic partner and seeks to attain peace through strength. As Zelensky says, it would be useful for Russia if the strength were directed against it, since they are the aggressor. Zelensky noted that the United States of America has chosen the position of being a mediator in resolving the war of Russia against Ukraine. Quote, "We strive for a common understanding that Russia is the aggressor, not us. We really want the United States not to look for balance in these words. I understand what President Donald Trump wants. I deeply respect the fact that he is looking for his own approach. That is his approach." The Ukrainian president then thanked Trump and the American people for helping Ukraine confront Russian aggression. Next, a quote, "Inspectors from the United States of America, Europe, and Ukraine are working. The Ministry of Defense maintains full accountability, record keeping, and transparency. There is access to all the figures, starting from the first year of the war. Access has always been available." Zelensky stated that Ukraine has received roughly $105 billion from the United States, primarily in the form of weapons. Zelensky clarified that American weapons arrived in Ukraine, but some funds were used for transportation. He explained that Ukrainian companies did not have the right to receive money for transportation, so Kyiv did not receive money either in the public or private sector. Zelensky added that the United States of America received a report on the largest land operation as well as the conduct of war in many years. Therefore, the states, quote, "know where to invest money and where not to invest." These are the main points Zelensky made in his Ben Shapiro interview. Now we move on to the most crucial and fascinating part. So, one of the most prominent conservative commentators, Ben Shapiro, gave his feedback after the interview with Volodymyr Zelensky. Once again, he has 7.5 million subscribers on YouTube and Twitter, and founded the Daily Wire. Plus, together with Joe Rogan, he has always been among the top supporters of Donald Trump. And now I'll quote directly. Also, I'll probably leave a link to the full interview and Ben Shapiro's statement in my Telegram channel. It's called Pechi News. The link is in the description. So subscribe if you want to listen to all of this in full. I'll give you the main points. I'll quote the main points of Ben Shapiro after the interview with Zelensky. Let me emphasize again before I start quoting that Ben Shapiro has always been a staunch supporter of Donald Trump. And now I quote, "Did I get answers to all my questions? I can't say that I did completely. I don't know where every dollar goes. There are questions about corruption. But the thing is, one of the biggest problems in American foreign policy over the last 80 years has been this strange idea that if our allies aren't perfect, we should just abandon them. We abandoned Vietnam and let the Viet Cong take them over. The same thing happened in Afghanistan, where our allies were very imperfect. But it turned out that the people on the other side were much worse. So the question is not whether Ukraine is perfect. Of course not. The question is much bigger. What does Russia want and what is in the interest of the United States of America? According to Shapiro, a growing and strengthening Russia does not serve the interests of the United States. When the Russian Federation seized Crimea and Donbass in 2014 and then invaded in 2022, this is not the case where we need to figure out where the rational middle ground is. You can look for a solution, but it doesn't make sense if you can't implement it. The United States of America can't implement it because we don't have boots on the ground. And we don't want boots on the ground. But we want to bring Russia to the negotiating table. Here's the next statement by Ben Shapiro that I especially liked, quote,
Ukrainians are at the negotiating table, but the Russians are not. We are not the dominant regional force, and we don't aspire to be. The Ukrainians' presence at the table means it's time for the Russians to come to the table. The question is, how do you get them there? Vladimir Zelensky has talked about it in this interview. He's already agreed to an immediate 30-day ceasefire. The Russians have not. He's already agreed to a rare earth minerals deal with the United States. That is heavily.
The Ukrainians are at the table, the Russians are not. No, we are not the dominant power in the region, and we don't want to be. So how do we get the Russians to the table? Zelensky agreed to a ceasefire. The Russians did not. Zelensky agreed to a resource deal that is heavily skewed in favor of the United States of America. Ukrainians did not start this war. Ukrainians want security guarantees that are more reliable than what we gave them in 1994, referring to the Budapest Memorandum, when they gave up their nuclear weapons. Ukrainians want tangible realities, not just promises. Ukrainians have realized that Western promises tend to evaporate. Ukrainians want to join the European Union and NATO. This is reasonable as Russians continue pressuring. Zelensky agrees to a ceasefire. The example of Korea in 1953, North and South Korea demilitarized the line of separation. They stopped the fire and exchanged prisoners. The war ended. Officially, no, but in practice, North Korea understood that if it crossed the border, it would be wiped out. And partly because the United States military is stationed there, and Ukraine is not asking for United States troops. But the question people don't want to ask is, what exactly does the Russian Federation want? Putin said this in his speech on June 14, 2024. First, no NATO for Ukraine. Second, recognition of the occupation. Third, demilitarization and genocification, which in practice means installing a puppet regime in Kiev. Lifting all sanctions, as Ben Shapiro says, is called capitulation. Ukraine cannot surrender and live under Putin's whip, who has killed tens of thousands of Ukrainians and abducted tens of thousands of children. The magical negotiator of Trump, Steve Witkoff, seems to think that the problem in Ukraine, or that Russia can be appeased, that if you write tough tweets, Putin will suddenly become friendly. Shouting at Putin on Trust Social is not what will bring the war to an end. Once again, attention, this is a quote from Ben Shapiro. Once again, this is a conservative publicist, a supporter of Donald Trump, writing, "Shouting at Putin on Trust Social is not what will bring the war to an end." I continue to quote. The United States is demanding more from Ukraine, including acknowledging Russian control over Donbass and Crimea and barring itself from NATO membership, without offering substantial security assurances in return. This proposal was put on the table by the so-called master negotiator Steve Witkoff. The Russian Federation is supposedly refusing to seize the rest of Ukraine, but this is not a concession because Ukrainians are fighting for it. It's not because Putin suddenly decided to become a good guy and refused to seize Kyiv or Lviv. That's because the Ukrainian army stopped him, yes, with American and European help. And that's exactly why stopping aid from the United States of America could cost Ukraine the outcome of the war. Now, Trump wants to pull out of the negotiations, but there's a nuance. The Russian Federation would be happy for this to happen. It wants the war to continue. For them, negotiations are a code for continuing the war. They want to eat Ukraine piece by piece until they've swallowed it whole. Why? Because Ukraine is the key to the Russian vision of their empire. And this empire is irreparably set against the United States of America. In general, these are the main points of Ben Shapiro as he reacts after the interview with Zelensky. So I decided that it's very important to point this out, because Ben Shapiro is a supporter of Donald Trump and he has always campaigned for him. This is a conservative publicist with a huge audience who suddenly declares that Trump is doing foolish things. This foreign policy is foolish and shows a complete misunderstanding of the situation. And yelling at Putin on Truth Social is not what brings the war to an end. There's still a lot more. Ben Shapiro talks very interestingly about anti-Trump and anti-American sentiments in Russia. He questions why Trump's team is unwilling to acknowledge that Russians hate America, though the reason for this hatred is unclear. He wonders why Trump doesn't want to see this. Ben Shapiro goes on there to talk about Dugin. He calls him the ideologist of the Russian world, believing his brain is completely scrambled, and that all of Russia lives according to this model of scrambled brains. And so on and so on. That is, once again, I'll repeat myself, I'll leave the link to the full video of Ben Shapiro on my Telegram channel. It's called Peachy News. Be sure to go there and subscribe. If anyone wants to, you can listen to it in full in the original English. But for me, it was really a revelation that Ben Shapiro says things like that. I hope that after Donald Trump said yesterday that he has doubts about whether Putin really wants to end the war, well, maybe there will be some shifts. Because, well, Ben Shapiro, no matter how you look at it, shapes public opinion. Ben Shapiro, Joe Rogan, who else can we mention? Dave Portnoy. All of them can really be considered part of the camp of Donald Trump supporters who shaped public opinion during the election campaign. And now they can turn this public opinion in another direction. And Ben Shapiro made everything quite clear. So friends, I'll leave it at that. Be sure to write your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. Thank you for your support. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.